The first of the men that we are commemorating today is Alfred Reed of Burgh, Heath. Now, his parents came from the same tiny village down in Wiltshire. His father was something of an itinerant cowman. He'd always been moving from farm to farm with his work. And they'd lived at least 4 different addresses before they came up to this area where Alfred was born. They'd come to Cheam Court Cottages, which used to stand on the corner of Cheam Crossroads in Cheam High Street. They're shops now, and it's hard to think of a time when that was farmland there. But they lived in a couple of in a little rundown cottage there with their young, growing family. Alfred was born in 1894, probably about a year or two after they arrived. They didn't stay there long, as was their usual pattern, and they moved on after a couple of years and came up here to Burgh, Heath. They originally lived in Reed's Rest Cottages, a pair of semi-detached cottages that still stand today down Cannon's Lane. Alfred's father and his 2 older brothers were both working as cowmen and dairymen, and they were probably working at Cannon's farm for Matthew Templeton. After just a few years there, they were on the move again, not too far this time, just down to Oaklands Road. They moved to number 19, now number 38. It's a semi-detached house, just a few years old. They had 6 children by this point, so they needed a bit more room, perhaps. Conditions weren't that great, even though they were modern houses. They're quite dark, they're quite cramped. We find, it not unusual to have 10 or 11 people, 3 households, all living together in one of these houses at the time. Their children were getting older, and they were growing up. And they may have had, the eldest boys may have brought their wives to live with them there as well. They soon moved out. They moved across the Brighton Road to number 5, Memory Cottages. They moved in after the Blakers. We commemorated Willie Blaker just a couple of months ago, after the Blakers had come the other way, doing a swap and going to Oaklands Road as the Reeds moved over the road to Memory Cottages. They are still there today. They're sort of rather hidden away on the green. They were hidden by the Surrey Yeoman before, which is unfortunately no longer with us. There are houses there now, but all 5 of the Memory Cottages are still there by the old gravel track, which gave them their original name of Gravel Lane Cottages. Alfred went to school in Burgh, Heath. He went to the Church of England school, the building known as Chips Folly, which stands opposite St Mary's, a church that had yet to be built at the time the Reeds first moved in. He had a sort of an average level of education for the times. He was quite well behaved. The headmaster there was quite trigger happy with his cane, and Albert only got into his bad books once, 2 slaps on the hand for incessant talking, which was a favourite offence in the school at that time. He became a gardener after he left, probably working at one of the local big houses, perhaps on the Nork estate, and was still working as a gardener when war broke out. He joined the army. He enlisted quite early in the war, and he signed up with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Now, unfortunately, the RAMC is quite a monolithic organisation, and for most of our men who served with them, it's very difficult to track down exactly what it is they were doing and where they were. And we know very little about what Alfred was up to. We do know that he went to Egypt in April of 1915. It was about the time of the Gallipoli landings. He arrived in Egypt a fortnight before those landings, and he was probably there to treat the wounded from that. We don't know whether he was with an advanced medical unit that was actually near the men or with the men, or whether he was working at a base hospital. All the wounded were evacuated from Gallipoli to base hospitals in Egypt and at Malta. So he may have served in the Mediterranean theatre during the Gallipoli campaign. After that campaign, the men that were involved went back to the Western Front, or they went to Salonika in Greece, or they went into the Middle East to fight the campaigns there. And also, at that time, the RAMC men were being sent to East Africa as well, where a campaign was being fought. And the only other thing we really know about Alfred was that he was in Tanzania when he died in December 1918. We haven't talked at all about the East African campaign in the 4 years that we've been doing these commemorations. To us, it is a sideshow. To the people that lived there, it was a devastating conflict. It caused hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, both directly and indirectly as a result of the disease that our troops brought with them, the starvation that people suffered when we confiscated their food to feed our own men, and the starvation of famines from when we burnt the crops to deny the Germans the opportunity to take those for themselves. If you can imagine a band of British colonies that stretched all the way from Cairo to Cape Town, like a sort of a game of noughts and crosses where we'd got all of the right-hand side was our row of X's. The Germans had sort of blocked us a bit, and they got a colony right in the middle of that band. German East Africa, what we now call Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi. And it gave them a little strategic foothold in that corner of Africa. They had 4 African colonies, all scattered around, all isolated and surrounded by the colonies of allied nations or neutral nations. It also gave them a base on the east coast of Africa from which they could launch commerce raiding ships to go and disrupt our convoys in the Indian Ocean. So it was very important that we dealt with them swiftly and surely right at the start of the war. Some of those first shots of the war were fired near Lake Victoria on the 5th of August 1914 in a little local skirmish. And 3 days later, HMS Australia, a ship that Percy Perrin of Burgh Heath would later serve on, the chap I mentioned who was buried in South Africa a little while ago, they fired salvos to destroy the wireless station in the port at Dar es Salaam. And after that, there was a break, a little 2-month, 3-month respite for the Germans to gather their forces, to implement their plans that they'd put in place long before the war. And so when the Indian Expeditionary Force landed in November 1914 attempting to take German East Africa, they were met by prepared German defence and were absolutely routed soon after they had landed. The Germans withdrew into the hinterland of the country. They struck first, despite the fact they only ever had a maximum of 14,000 soldiers, and they were facing a vastly superior foe in terms of numbers. They struck first, and they split up their force and started attacking British colonies north and south of their East African colony. In 1916, we had to deal with this. General Jan Smuts of South Africa, the Boer War commander, a guerrilla warfare veteran, the perfect man for the job, led 3 columns from 3 directions into German East Africa to squeeze these German guerrilla fighters together. But the German guerrillas slipped through the net and headed into the southern half of East Africa. What Smuts did manage to do was to capture the majority of that country's transport infrastructure. And Dar es Salaam, the port on the east coast, became an important hub for the British to supply their forces in the field. It was connected to important points in the campaign by railway and by road. And it's here that Alfred Reed ends up towards the end of the war. It's most likely he was probably working in a base hospital there. There were at least 3 hospitals operating in Dar es Salaam. Men would be gathered there prior to evacuation to India or down the coast to South Africa. In the autumn of 1918, Spanish flu arrived in port. It first struck the west coast of Africa, Freetown in Sierra Leone, the coaling station there. All the natives that were employed on coaling were infected. They passed this infection on to every ship that then called in. The infection spread round Africa to the ports in South Africa and then onto the East African coast. And it arrived sometime around the end of October, the beginning of November in Tanzania. The death rate in Tanzania of Allied servicemen since past the peak of the fighting had subsided to about 45 a month. Well, it skyrocketed to 150 in November and a similar number in December as well. Men were dropping like flies. It was spreading like wildfire through the camps and in particular through the hospitals. Where there were strict administrative controls in place, we could implement precautions. Even if they were followed, they were not necessarily that effective. And of course, the vast ungovernable continent of Africa meant that there were strict administrative controls only in a very few places. And it spread throughout the country very quickly. It came at a time as troops were demobilising and the African levies and troops that had been fighting for the British were being demobilised, and they carried this illness back home to their home villages. Many of them had been completely unaffected by the war up until that point, only suddenly to be wiped out just as the armistice had been signed. The disease struck the young and the healthy particularly badly. It's their vigorous immune system's own overreaction that killed them. The complications set in. Pneumonia, if it set in, was very often fatal. It could kill within hours or a couple of days. And it's to this that Alfred succumbed, presumably first having contracted Spanish flu. He was buried in Dar es Salaam cemetery. His headstone inscription, "Gone but not forgotten, mother," chosen by his mother. He died on the 31st of December 1918, 100 years ago today, aged just 24, the youngest of the four men we are commemorating today.